Now we are back to this layering architecture diagram that we saw back in lecture 13 when we talk about the three underlying design principles of the internet. And here we wrote down a bunch of acronyms. Okay, network engineers are not shy about inventing new acronyms. You can actually have about 1,000 commonly used acronyms and probably 100,000 all kinds of acronyms. Each standardization body can easily generate 5,000 acronyms. So you can have an encyclopedia of nothing but network protocol acronyms. Okay, but we're going to just highlight a few important ones. Now you see the physical layer, which could be the wireless medium, fiber, copper, or cable medium. And then there's a link layer. For example, next lecture we'll talk about Wi-Fi CSMA for controlling access to the communication medium. Then there's the network layer running IP protocol for connectivity discovery. Then it comes to something very important for video, the transport protocol. Okay, we will see soon that there's something called RTP and also UDP that are alternatives to TCP and often viewed as more suitable for video traffic. Then there is the application layer. Okay, there's a lot of protocols, important and familiar ones like HTTP that you have seen using web browsing. Okay. SIP, IGMP, RTSP are all multimedia related. Okay, we'll come to talk some of these in just about 10 minutes or so. And then I just separate this out. This is a little non-uniform notation. Some people will call the compression standard as part of the application layer, as part of the media playback applications. But I just separate it out to highlight that things like MPEG and a bunch of other video compression standards defines the way that the video are encoded and delivered. Okay, and then they sit on top of the application layer. So our focus in the first, this module of the video will be on compression, and then the next module on application and transport, with a few more details in the advanced material part of the lecture. And we will also see why certain transport layer protocols are chosen, in part because the kind of application compression layer technology used. So we see layering at work in defining functionality allocation, who does what in delivering video. Okay. Before we can talk about compression, let's first define what is a video. Okay. Video is nothing but a sequence of frames moving at a particular speed. Okay, so the speed could be, for example, 25 or 29.7 for standard definition TV, okay, depending on the standard and country you're talking about. For HD TV, it's say 50 or 60 frames a second. Okay, this is the kind of number of frames a second that's needed to sustain a motion, that perception in human brain. Now, each of these frames per second is nothing but a still picture. A still picture is basically a bunch of pixels. Okay? Even in retina display, the pixels are just very, very small for human eyes to detect the edges of the pixel. So what's a pixel then? Each pixel is really the colors and the luminance encoded digitally in bits. So the colors can be based on a convex combination of the three primary colors or other kind of three color coordinates. Okay. And the bit rate, therefore, is basically the number of frames per second times the number of bits per frame. So what kind of number are we talking about here? Well, number of frames per second would be 60 or 50, right? Number of bits per frame depends on the resolution. Okay, a certain HD TV is 1280 by 720 pixels. Okay, so that is altogether how many pixels? 921600 pixels. Or it could be 1920 times 1080. So that's 1920 by 1080. Okay. That will give you a much bigger number. Okay, 20736004. That's a big number. Okay, and that is just the pixel count. And then I have to say how many bits per pixel. Per pixel. Well, depending on how many colors I'm trying to encode and the level of differentiation of the luminance, but let's say you need, say, 32 bits for each pixel. And then you multiply the number of pixels per frame. Then you multiply the number of frames per second. You will see this is a very big number for the raw bit rate of a video, or at least HD video. So here comes the role of compression. Compression is basically an exercise to remove redundancy in signals, whether that's a data, text signal, speech signal, image, or moving picture signals. There are two kinds of compression. One is lossless. Okay, basically, you can compress the signal, get it out, let it go through the pipe or the internet, and then decompress it. This is compression, this is decompression. And then the output can be made to be identical to the input. Not very similar, but exactly identical. That's called lossless compression. For example, a famous lossless compression technique is Lempo-Zip. And that's the underlying compression method for zip that you use for zipping and compressing files on your computer. And then there's lossy compression that says what comes out of the decompressor is actually close to what went in the compressor, but is not quite the same. So if this signal is x, this is x hat, then I can look at the difference between x and x hat. For example, the L1 norm, the absolute difference, we'll use that in a minute, or L2 norm. Okay. Now I can look at basically the each not as a scalar single number, but as a long vector, okay, of the bits representing the signal. In lossy compression, therefore, there's no free lunch. There's a trade-off between compression ratio, that is, how much do you reduce the bit rate, and the resulting fidelity. Okay, for example, hey, I can give a compression of 100. I can take 100 bits per second and down to 1 bit per second, but the resulting fidelity might suffer. And if I make this compression ratio less aggressive, say 10, then the resulting fidelity might be better. So in general, we are looking at this trade-off through a picture called the rate distortion curve. So I plot the rate on the axis, that is the playback rate, for example, or the encoding rate of the video, and the D as the distortion on the y-axis. This again can be measured by L1 norm, L2 norm, or whatever you like. And in general, the trade-off between the two is a curve of this shape. Okay, it's a convex curved shape, convex shaped curve. And if you can invent a better compression, you are basically, geometrically speaking, pushing this convex shaped curve towards the origin. In other words, for the same playback rate, bit rate, I can give you a much lower distortion compared to before, or alternatively, for the same kind of distortion that I require, instead of this much data bit rate, I can take in a much lower bit rate requirement. Okay, so this will represent an enhancement of the compression technology. Okay. Now, which bit rate should I pick then? Part of that depends on the distortion that's tolerable, okay, including factors like your kind of screen that you're using. Is a retina display or not? Part of that depends on the channel condition. If the channel is in a bad condition for congestion reason or air interface interference reasons, then you may say, well, let's take a smaller bit rate. And part of that can also, in today's economic environment, depends on the usage quota. It would be quota-aware video adaptation to see how much quota you still have, or we project you will have towards the end of the billing cycle, and adjust bit rate accordingly. So in general, it can be a combination of these factors. And you may wonder, what can I compress? How can I actually compress a factor of 100, a factor of 1,000? Are you sure that only 1% or 0.1% of the signal is actually needed? Well, first of all, there are distortion, so don't forget about that. And second, you'll be surprised to see the amount of redundancy in the signals. Okay? For example, for motion picture, frame-to-frame similarities can be striking. Okay? Certainly for talk shows, but even for motion-rich movies, because human perception, our neurons in the brain rely on the similarities between one frame and the next frame to register motion. That's how motions can be registered. So that's precisely because of the redundancy. So when you transmit, for example, you can say, gee, I will just transmit this picture. Okay, it's two guys fighting. And the next picture is still two guys fighting, except this guy's arm moves upward. So just focus on this part. The rest remain the same. That's one way to compress. Take advantage of redundancy. Another way is take advantage of human visual limitations. Okay, even though there are differences, we may not be able to process that in the brain. Okay, for example, there are certain range of frequency in the signal that people tend not to be able to detect very well, the differences. So examples like transform coding, you put it into the correct representation of coordinates in, say, frequency domain, then you look at the decomposed components of the signal, and then you start ignoring the higher order ones. The third way is a statistical structure. Okay, certain things just happen a lot more often. For example, in text or speech encoding, people use Huffman coding, where you give a shorter description length to more frequently occurring syllables or phrases. Okay. In this way, the average, the expected length you need to encode a paragraph or a textbook will be smaller. And indeed, in, say, Morse code, you will see that the more often used letters in the alphabet are given a shorter representation. So whether it's redundancy of human visual limitation or statistical structure in the signal, there are many places where you can compress. And indeed, people have worked very hard over the past 20 years and more to compress motion pictures. Okay. So MPEG is a key family of compression standards. For example, MPEG-1 back in 1992 was used for VCD. Okay. And we're talking about something like 1 megabit per second bit rate for encoding and playback. Then MPEG-2, which is also called H.262, because there's a United Nations ITU, International Telecommunication Union, standardization body that names a bunch of standards H. something. Okay. So whatever name it is, it was done in 1996, and DVD, which in the last 10 plus years pretty much is the dominant medium for storing TVs and videos. And this uses now about 10 megabit per second, a much better quality than VCD. Okay. It's actually hard to find VCDs these days. And then, of course, you must have heard of MP3. You must have listened to MP3 music. Okay, these are audio tracks that's recorded and compressed using the standard. It actually is not a standalone standard. It is the layer 3 of MPEG-2. Okay, layer 3 here is nothing to do with the protocol layers in the network community. Okay, this is one module of MPEG-2 motion picture standardization where you compress the audio track. Now you may wonder, what about MPEG-3? There's MPEG-1, 2, 4. Well, MP3 is not MPEG-3, it's part of MPEG-2. There were actually no MPEG-3. It started, but then was absorbed back into MPEG-2. Okay. And MP3, for example, can get a compression ratio of 12:1 for music. And to people who listen to it in a crowded spot or on the subway, probably that's good enough. Okay, but if you listen in a quiet space, then you can tell the difference between an MP3 music versus, for example, DVD quality. And then in 2000, it was MPEG-4. Okay? And this is the current family of video compression standard that people use. For example, in 2004, the part 10 of MPEG-4. So people start to realize, well, let's name the different parts instead of naming it MPEG 5, 6, 7, 8, so on. Now, this part 10 is also called H.264. This is, at this point, sort of a major video compression standard. It's got 16 so-called profiles. It gives you quite a bit of flexibility for different types of video. It is used for like HD TV and Blu-ray. Okay. HD TV, if you want a real HD TV, is more like 20 megabit per second. For Blu-ray, something like 40 megabit per second. Okay, and this can get a factor of 100 easily. Okay, it tend to be on the order of 1 to 200 compression ratio. And that's what made it possible to squeeze that many bits through the internet. Now, these are not the only ones. There are quite a few others. For example, H.261 was once upon a time quite a popular one, okay, for IP video. Apple has QuickTime that's merging into MPEG-4 now. Windows has Windows Media Player. Okay? Adobe has Flash, and Real Networks has Real Media Player. So these are the main types of playback formats and standards. And there are, as you can see, still proprietary ones. And that's what makes it a little bit difficult. For example, on a lot of Apple devices, they don't like Flash, as they believe it consumes more energy than needed, and so on and so forth. Now, whatever is the right side of the argument between Apple and Adobe, you can see that there are so many different compression standards out there. A lot of them utilize the redundancy from one frame to another. And this is what we call a group of picture concept. So we're going to encode all these frames into blocks. Each block is called a GOP, a group of pictures. Okay. And a group of pictures consists of three kinds of frames, three types of frames. Not three frames. Three types of frames, okay, called I, P, and B frame. So I frame is called intra-coded frame. And each GOP always starts with an I frame. This is the frame whose encoding does not depend on the frames before or after it. Okay. For example, when you switch from two guys fighting to, you know, one guy laying on the ground. All right. So you say, all right, this I'm going to start an independent frame here. And there will be also something called a P frame. Okay. P is called a predictive coded. And this is type frame that depends on the previous I or P frame. So it would depend on the previous I or P frame. Okay, as the reference point. For example, this is a P frame. Okay, and then B frame is called a bidirectionally predictive coded, and this is the type of frame that depends on both before and after. Okay, the I or P frames that's before or after it. Now you see that I draw I, P, and B frames with different heights, because the height represents the size of the frame. I frame, as you can see, is the most important one. Okay, it starts each GOP and is independently encoded. It doesn't depend on the previous or future ones, so it takes the largest number of bits to encode. And the P frame tend to be much shorter, takes a lot fewer bits, and B frames leverage the motion pictures frame-to-frame redundancy most, okay, before or after, and therefore it takes the fewest number of bits to encode a B frame. Okay. Now, how should I decide the length of the GOP, and what kind of IPB structure should I use? That depends on quite a few different factors. For example, the bitrate efficiency. If you want a very efficient compression, then you should say that, well, once you start an iframe, don't start a new iframe. Just keep piling on P frame and B frame because these are small frames. The bitrate becomes lower. Okay? But as we'll see an example momentarily, error resilience then suffers. Okay, if an iframe is lost, you have to retransmit the entire GOP. Okay? And a longer GOP means if something goes wrong, like iframe goes down, then you have to retransmit a lot more frames. So there's a trade-off between bitrate efficiency and resilience to errors. And then there's also instant channel change, at least in IPTV scenarios where the operators still have to maintain the TV-like experience, where you hold a remote and you know, there's up and down button of the channel. Certain people watch TV like this. They just keep flipping, boom, 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 right? They stay on each channel for about 10 seconds, and then they flip through 200 channels, and then they go to sleep. So if you want to give an instant channel change, okay, you press and immediately can see the screen, as in the old days of TV, then you have to do quite a few things. We will see in a minute. You will actually have to use unicast to help with multicast of channelized content on TV. And another implication is that because a GOP represents a single logical basic unit for playback, a longer GOP means that you have to wait longer to change channels. Okay, you need to wait until a new GOP kicks in. Okay. So it's not that easy actually to decide either the length or the structure of each GOP. So here's a particular example to illustrate one point, that is the error resilience of different types of frames. Okay, let's say we have a very simple example. Okay, we have a GOP structure that is IPBB. That's it. Okay, it's a very short GOP. Okay, start with I always, and then suppose we say there's a P and then two B's, and then that's it. Only 4 frames. Okay. And let's say we measure error by the L1 norm. Okay, so the pixel value, okay, for the ith frame, okay, at the coordinate x and y. So this is ith frame, and the coordinate x and y is got a certain pixel value. Don't worry about whether this is the color or luminance. Just say this is a single number. Okay. Then suppose something happens, an error occurred. Okay, and then you lead to a different kind of pixel value used at the playback. Let's call that p bar sub I xy. Okay. Then we want to look at the difference between this and this, the absolute value of that difference, and then you sum across x, y coordinates and all the frames I. Okay, so this will be our error metric. And let's say we have a very small video. Okay, it's only 2 by 2 pixels, so altogether 4 pixels. And let's say this is a very boring video. Okay, the first iframe is just 1, 1, 1, 1. That's my video. Okay, say, wow, this is a small video. Okay, with let's say no color, only luminance, and is uniform spatially. Okay, I doubt if this will become a very popular YouTube video, but let's say it's actually, it gets even worse. Not only is boring at one frame, is very boring for all the future frames too. So the I frame is just all pixels 1, 1, 1, 1. P frame is all pixels 2, and then all pixels 3, and then all pixels 4. All right, so that is my GOP. Okay, 2 by 2 pixels, 4 pixels altogether in this each frame, and IPBB frame. I like that. Okay. Then before this GOP, there is the previous GOP, and ended with, let's say, a blank screen. And that was the previous GOP's B frame. And then there's a next GOP. Okay, let's say it's 5, 5, 5, 5. And that must be an I frame. All right. So if everything goes through, then there's nothing to talk about here. But we're talking about error residing. So let's say there's an error. And we're going to look at the impact if we drop I frame as opposed to dropping P frame, as opposed to dropping, say, the first B frame. How much is the error according to this metric? All right, first example, that I frame is dropped in the channel, in the network. The receiver say, oh, no I frame. Then what can I do? Well, let's say the error treatment protocol on the receiver playbacks that if the I frame is lost, then you just repeat the lost frame. Suppose that's the case. Okay. You could also say that if I frame is lost, please retransmit the whole GOP. I can't play without an I frame. That's another possibility. But let's say I frame dropped, then you just repeat. And what would happen is that you will get 0 for the I frame and the playback. Actually, it's 0, 0, 0, 0. But, you know, advantage of using this boring video example is that we can just represent this video with a single number because every pixel is the same number. All right. So it's 0. Okay. And then the P frame says, all right, I need to look at the previous frame. Okay. Well, the previous frame says 0. So, okay, I'm going to say, is this 0? Okay. And the B frame will say, I can look at either the I or P frame before me or the I or P frame after me. Now, after me is 5. That's the next GOPs, but nonetheless. So I say, well, there's my P, there's my I. The P one says that, hey, you know, I'm just copying from a dropped packet. Okay. Then the B frame will say, then I have to look at the one after me. And that one after me is 5, so I'm going to use 5. Okay. And then same story for this B frame. That's 5. So instead of displaying, it should be 1, 2, 3, 4 for these 4 frames. Now you're getting 0, 0, 5, 5. As you can see, the error basically becomes 1 minus 0 plus 2 minus 0 plus 3 minus 5 plus 4 minus 5. Well, that's only for one pixel location. There are 4 such pixels, all identical. So times 4, and you get 24. So the error incurred is 24 units if you drop I frame. Now, what if you drop P frame? Okay. The I frame is properly received is 1, okay, or 1, 1, 1, 1. The P frame is dropped, so you just look at the previous I frame, and then it will say I'm also 1. Okay. And same thing, the B frame, we'll look at before and after. We'll say, well, before it's lost, but fortunately after is still there, so I'm going to use the after the IOP frame, the first IOP frame right after me, and the value is 5, just as last slide, and this is 5. So now if you count the error, is actually 16 now, which is smaller than 24. If you instead drop a B frame, okay, then what you see is the following. This is one GOP. You get 1 correctly, you get 2 correctly. Let's say this 3 is dropped. So the B frame will say, I'm going to look at the one before me. Okay, or after me. But the one before me, the first IOP frame before me is already properly received, so I just use that value, so I use 2. Okay. And then the next one is properly received. So get 1, 2, 2, 4, and you can easily see that the error in this case simply restricted locally to this B frame, and that is 4, which is less than 16, which is less than 24. So this difference explains or quantifies the impact of dropping an I versus P versus B frame. All right, so now in the last and the final module of this lecture before advanced material part, we will now talk about application and transport layer below the compression layer, and see some of the networking ideas that goes into supporting video there.